The mason's eyes widened as he ran his weathered fingers along the perfectly fitted stones, each joint so precise it seemed like the wall had grown from the earth itself. Behind him, Judith Gutierrez stood frozen, her clipboard of violations trembling in her manicured hands as she watched her entire power structure crumble with a single expert assessment. The master craftsman from the Regional Mason Guild turned to face her, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of tradition. "Ma'am, I don't know who built this wall, but this is museum-quality stonework. Whoever did this is operating at a level most of us can only dream of achieving." Judith's face had gone pale, the color draining from her cheeks as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. Just 3 weeks earlier, she had been so confident, so certain that her authority as HOA president gave her the right to dictate every aspect of our neighborhood's appearance. She had no idea that her petty power play would expose her own ignorance and ultimately lead to her complete humiliation in front of the entire community. My name is Raymond Cook, and for the past 15 years, I've been living quietly in the Meadowbrook Hill subdivision, working as a software engineer by day and pursuing my passion for traditional stonemasonry in my spare time. Most of my neighbors knew me as the quiet guy who kept to himself, always polite but never really involved in community drama. What they didn't know was that I had spent over 2 decades studying under master masons across Europe, learning techniques that had been passed down through generations of craftsmen. My garage workshop was filled with specialized tools that most people wouldn't recognize, and my understanding of stone construction went far beyond what any typical homeowner would possess. All I wanted was to live peacefully, tend to my small garden, and maybe build the occasional stone feature to beautify my property. Those troubles started on a crisp October morning when I decided to replace the crumbling concrete retaining wall that ran along the front edge of my property. The previous wall had been installed by the builder 20 years ago and was falling apart, with chunks of concrete regularly breaking off and cluttering the sidewalk. I had been planning this project for months, carefully selecting each stone from a quarry 2 hours away, choosing pieces that would work together both structurally and aesthetically. The replacement wall would be the same height as the original, serve the same function, and actually improve the neighborhood's appearance significantly. I pulled the proper permits from the city, checked all local building codes, and even had the utility lines marked before beginning work. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story gets absolutely wild, and I promise you'll want to stick around to see how a simple stone wall became the catalyst for the most satisfying takedown I've ever witnessed. I spent 3 weeks carefully constructing the wall, working in the early morning hours before my regular job and on weekends. Each stone was individually fitted, shaped when necessary, and placed with the precision that only comes from years of experience. The wall featured traditional dry stone construction techniques, with each piece locked in place by the weight and positioning of the stones around it. No mortar was needed, and the result was both stronger and more beautiful than any modern concrete alternative. The craftsmanship was evident to anyone who understood stonework, from the perfectly level courses to the subtle batter that ensured long-term stability. The wall was nearly complete when Judith Gutierrez made her first appearance. I was putting the finishing touches on the capstones when I heard the sharp click of high heels on concrete behind me. Turning around, I saw a woman in her 50s approaching with a clipboard and an expression that suggested she was about to make my day significantly worse. She was dressed in what I would later learn was her standard HOA president uniform, a crisp blazer, pressed slacks, and an air of absolute authority that she wore like armor. "Excuse me," she called out in a tone that was anything but polite, "but I need to speak with you about this unauthorized construction project." I straightened up, wiping stone dust from my hands with a rag, and tried to keep my voice level. "Good morning, I'm Raymond Cook, and this isn't unauthorized. I pulled all the proper permits and checked with the city before starting." Judith looked at me like I had just told her the earth was flat. "Permits from the city don't matter here. This is a planned community with strict architectural guidelines, and any exterior modifications must be approved by the HOA Architectural Review Committee. You should have submitted plans and received written approval before beginning any work." I felt my stomach drop as I realized what was happening. In all my careful preparation, I had somehow missed the HOA requirements. I wasn't aware of that process, Bruce, and I admitted. The previous wall was concrete, and I'm replacing it with natural stone. It's the same height, same footprint, and actually much more attractive. Judith's expression didn't soften even slightly. That's irrelevant. The rules exist for a reason, and they apply to everyone equally. You'll need to submit a formal application for review, and until it's approved, this construction needs to stop immediately. She handed me a thick packet of forms and continued. Furthermore, based on what I'm seeing here, this wall doesn't conform to our community standards. The architectural guidelines clearly state that retaining walls should be constructed of materials that complement the existing neighborhood aesthetic. This rustic stone look is completely inappropriate for our modern subdivision. I looked at the wall I had spent weeks perfecting, then back at Judith's disapproving face. This is high-quality natural stone, professionally installed. It's actually much more valuable and durable than concrete. Value isn't the issue, Judith snapped. Consistency is. We have standards here, and your little arts and crafts project doesn't meet them. You have 48 hours to submit your application, and if the committee determines that this wall is inappropriate, you'll need to tear it down and rebuild it according to our specifications. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with a stack of forms and a growing sense of disbelief. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table reading through the HOA documentation, trying to understand how I had gotten myself into this mess. The architectural guidelines were indeed extensive, covering everything from approved paint colors to landscaping requirements. The section on retaining walls was particularly specific, stating that all such structures should be constructed of contemporary materials that all maintain visual harmony with the community's modern aesthetic. The language was vague enough to be interpreted however the committee chose, and it was clear that natural stone would be considered inconsistent with their vision. The application process was equally daunting. I would need to submit detailed plans, material specifications, and even color samples for review. The committee met only once per month, and their next meeting wasn't for another 3 weeks. Even if they approved my application, which seemed unlikely given Judith's reaction, the process would take at least a month to complete. Meanwhile, my property would be left with a half-finished wall and constant scrutiny from the HOA. I decided to try reasoning with Judith directly. The next morning, I called the HOA office and requested a meeting to discuss my situation. Judith agreed to see me that afternoon, though her tone suggested she considered it a waste of time. I arrived at the community center with photos of my wall from various angles, hoping to demonstrate the quality of the workmanship and its positive impact on the neighborhood's appearance. Mr. Cook, Judith began before I could even sit down, I hope you're here to discuss your compliance timeline. The committee has already reviewed your situation, and we're prepared to issue formal violations if necessary. I placed the photos on her desk and tried to maintain a calm demeanor. Actually, I was hoping we could discuss this reasonably. This wall is professionally constructed using traditional techniques that have been proven over centuries. It's actually an improvement over what was there before. Judith barely glanced at the photos. Mr. Cook, I don't think you understand the situation here. This isn't about the quality of your work or your personal preferences. This is about maintaining property values and community standards. When residents start making unauthorized modifications, especially ones that deviate from our established aesthetic, it creates a precedent that undermines everything we've worked to build here. I tried a different approach. What if I could demonstrate that natural stone actually increases property values more than concrete? There are studies that show, Judith cut me off with a wave of her hand. Studies are irrelevant. What matters is consistency and compliance with our covenants. You signed those covenants when you bought your house, which means you agreed to follow our architectural guidelines. This isn't negotiable. The meeting went downhill from there. Judith made it clear that she viewed my wall as a direct challenge to her authority and the HOA's control over the community's appearance. She seemed personally offended that I had proceeded without seeking permission, and no amount of reasoning was going to change her mind. By the time I left her office, I understood that this wasn't really about the wall at all. This was about power, control, and making an example of someone who had dared to act independently. Over the next few days, I received a series of increasingly aggressive letters from the HOA. The first was a formal notice of violation, citing my failure to obtain proper approval for exterior modifications. The second threatened daily fines of $100 until the violation was corrected. The third informed me that if I didn't bring my property into compliance within 2 weeks, the HOA would take legal action to force removal of the wall at my expense. What frustrated me most was that Judith seemed to have no understanding of what she was actually looking at. During one of her inspection visits, she stood in front of my wall with a measuring tape, checking to ensure it didn't exceed the height restrictions. "This looks taller than the old wall," she declared, though her measurements clearly showed it was exactly the same height. When I pointed this out, she simply noted on her clipboard that the wall appeared to be oversized and would need to be verified by a professional surveyor. Her complaints became increasingly petty and ridiculous. She objected to the natural color variation in the stones, claiming it was inconsistent with neighborhood standards. She complained that the textured surface would collect dirt and become unsightly over time. She even suggested that the wall's traditional construction methods were somehow inferior to modern concrete techniques, despite having no knowledge of masonry or construction principles. The situation reached a breaking point when Judith brought several other HOA board members to inspect my wall. I watched from my living room window as she gestured dramatically at my stonework, clearly painting it as some kind of neighborhood crisis. The board members nodded along with her assessment, though I could tell that most of them had no idea what they were supposed to be looking at. One of them actually asked if the stones were real or if I had used some kind of artificial material. That evening, I received a call from Nathan Morris, my next-door neighbor and one of the few people in the subdivision who had actually complimented my wall. "Raymond," he said, "I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but Judith is telling everyone that your wall is structurally unsound and potentially dangerous. She's claiming that without proper mortar, the stones could shift and collapse, potentially injuring someone walking by." I felt my blood pressure rising as Nathan continued. "She's also saying that you're being stubborn and refusing to cooperate with the architectural review process. According to her version of events, you're some kind of rogue homeowner who thinks the rules don't apply to him." This was exactly the kind of character assassination I had been dreading. Judith wasn't content to simply enforce the HOA rules. She was actively working to turn the entire community against me. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to fight this battle on Judith's terms, I would use my knowledge and connections to expose her ignorance and potentially abusive use of power. I had been treating this as a simple bureaucratic misunderstanding, but Judith had made it personal. If she wanted to question my competence and integrity, then I would demonstrate exactly who she was dealing with. The next morning, I began making phone calls. My first call was to Master Andrea Ortiz, a renowned stonemason who had taught me advanced techniques during a workshop in Scotland 5 years earlier. Andrea was now the president of the Regional Mason Guild, an organization that certified craftsmen and promoted traditional building techniques throughout the southeastern United States. I explained my situation and asked if she would be willing to provide a professional assessment of my wall. "Raymond," Andrea said with a laugh, "from what you're describing, this HOA president has no idea what she's looking at. Dry stone construction is one of the most sophisticated building techniques in existence. If you built this wall using the methods I taught you, it's probably stronger and more durable than anything else in your neighborhood. I'd be happy to come take a look and provide an official assessment." My second call was to Jeremy Peterson, a friend from my software engineering days who had become a real estate attorney specializing in HOA disputes. Jeremy had seen cases like mine before and understood the legal landscape better than anyone. "The key thing to understand," he explained, "is that HOAs have broad authority to enforce architectural standards, but that authority has limits. If they're making decisions based on ignorance or personal biases rather than legitimate community interests, you might have grounds to challenge their actions." Jeremy agreed to review my HOA covenants and the correspondence I had received from Judith. He also suggested documenting everything carefully, including any statements Judith made about the structural integrity or safety of my wall. If she's making claims about engineering or construction that she's not qualified to make, That could be a problem for the HOA from a liability standpoint, he noted. Over the next few days, I quietly gathered information about Judith's background and her history as HOA president. What I discovered was illuminating. Judith had been elected to the board 3 years earlier, running on a platform of maintaining community standards and property values. However, her interpretation of those standards seemed to be entirely based on her personal preferences rather than any objective criteria. I spoke with several longtime residents who had dealt with Judith's architectural review process. The stories were remarkably consistent. Judith routinely rejected applications for improvements that she personally didn't like, regardless of their quality or appropriateness. She had forced one homeowner to remove a beautiful garden gate because it was too ornate for the neighborhood. Another resident had been required to repaint their house twice because Judith decided the approved color looked different in sunlight than it had on the sample card. Most telling was the story of Jack Morales, a retired contractor who had tried to install a simple wooden deck behind his house. Despite submitting detailed plans and using materials that exactly matched the HOA specifications, Judith had found reasons to reject his application 3 times. Jack eventually gave up and moved to a different neighborhood, selling his house at a loss rather than continue fighting with the HOA. The pattern was clear. Judith used her position to micromanage every aspect of the community's appearance according to her personal vision. She had no formal training in architecture, construction, or design, but she wielded her authority as if she were a professional in those fields. More importantly, she seemed to take particular pleasure in asserting control over residents who challenged her decisions or demonstrated expertise that exceeded her own. Armed with this information, I began developing a strategy. Rather than continuing to argue with Judith directly, I would arrange for qualified professionals to assess my wall and provide expert opinions that would be difficult for her to dismiss. If she wanted to claim that my work was substandard or inappropriate, she would have to make that argument in front of people who actually understood what they were looking at. Andrea Ortiz agreed to visit the following week, along with 2 other master masons from the guild. They would conduct a thorough assessment of my wall and provide a written report detailing their findings. Jeremy Peterson would also be present to ensure that everything was properly documented for potential legal proceedings. Meanwhile, I continued working on my wall in the early morning hours, ignoring the HOA's demand that I stop construction. Each day brought new threatening letters from Judith, but I was no longer intimidated by her bureaucratic posturing. I knew that my work was excellent, and soon I would have professional validation to prove it. The breakthrough came when I discovered something interesting in the HOA's own architectural guidelines. While the document emphasized contemporary materials and modern aesthetic, it also included a clause stating that traditional construction techniques and materials of exceptional quality may be considered on a case-by-case basis. This clause had apparently been included by the community's original developers, who wanted to allow for high-end custom features that might enhance property values. Judith had either overlooked this clause or chosen to ignore it, but it provided exactly the opening I needed. My wall wasn't just a violation of HOA standards, it was potentially an example of the kind of exceptional traditional craftsmanship that the guidelines were designed to accommodate. I decided to test Judith's knowledge one more time before bringing in the professionals. I called her office and requested another meeting, this time specifically to discuss the traditional construction techniques clause in the architectural guidelines. When I arrived at the community center, Judith was waiting with the same dismissive attitude she had shown in our previous encounters. "Mr. Cook," she began, "I hope you are here to discuss your compliance timeline. The board is prepared to begin legal proceedings if necessary." I placed a copy of the architectural guidelines on her desk, with the relevant clause highlighted. Actually, I wanted to discuss this section of the guidelines. It appears that traditional construction techniques of exceptional quality can be approved on a case-by-case basis. Judith glanced at the highlighted text with obvious annoyance. That clause refers to things like custom millwork or specialty materials for high-end renovations. It doesn't apply to retaining walls, and it certainly doesn't apply to your situation. I kept my voice calm and professional. "What makes you say that? The language seems quite broad, and it specifically mentions traditional construction techniques." "Mr. Cook, Judith said with exaggerated patience. I've been interpreting these guidelines for 3 years. I know what they mean and how they apply. Your wall is a clear violation, and no amount of creative reading is going to change that. She leaned back in her chair with a satisfied expression. Furthermore, even if that clause did apply, which it doesn't, you would still need to demonstrate that your work meets the exceptional quality standard. From what I've seen, your wall is amateur work at best. That statement was exactly what I had been hoping to hear. Judith had just made a definitive claim about the quality of my craftsmanship, despite having no qualifications to make such an assessment. More importantly, she had dismissed the possibility that my work could meet professional standards, setting herself up for a very public contradiction when the experts arrived. I appreciate your assessment, I said, standing to leave. I'll be sure to include your professional opinion in my documentation. Judith's eyes narrowed at my tone, but she didn't seem to grasp the implication of what I had just said. As far as she was concerned, she had won the argument and established her authority over the situation. Over the next few days, I made careful preparations for the guild's visit. I documented every aspect of my wall with high-resolution photographs, showing the precision of the joints, the stability of the structure, and the overall aesthetic impact. I also researched the specific techniques I had used, preparing detailed explanations of why each element had been constructed in a particular way. The morning of the assessment, I arrived at my property early to find Judith already there with 2 other board members. She was standing in front of my wall with her arms crossed, clearly intending to oversee the proceedings and ensure that her perspective was represented. "Mr. Cook," she called out as I approached, "I hope you understand that bringing in outside consultants doesn't change the HOA's authority over architectural decisions. Whatever these people tell you, the board's decision is final." I nodded politely and checked my watch. Andrea and her colleagues were due to arrive in 15 minutes, followed by Jeremy Peterson. I had also invited Nathan Morris to observe the proceedings, partly for moral support and partly to ensure that at least one sympathetic neighbor would witness whatever was about to happen. When Andrea Ortiz arrived, I could see Judith sizing her up dismissively. Andrea was a small woman in her 60s, dressed in practical work clothes and carrying a worn leather tool bag. To someone like Judith, who was accustomed to dealing with contractors in suits and business attire, Andrea probably looked like just another tradesperson whose opinion could be safely ignored. "Ms. Gutierrez," I said, making introductions. "This is Andrea Ortiz, president of the Regional Mason Guild. She's here to provide a professional assessment of my wall." Judith extended her hand with a patronizing smile. "Nice to meet you. I hope you will help Mr. Cook understand why this type of construction isn't appropriate for our community." Andrea's response was polite but firm. "I'll certainly provide an honest assessment based on professional standards. That's what the guild is for." She turned to examine my wall, running her hands along the stones and checking the alignment with a practiced eye. The 2 other master masons began their own inspection, using specialized tools to test the stability and precision of the construction. For the next 30 minutes, the 3 professionals conducted the most thorough evaluation my wall had ever received. They checked the foundation, measured the courses, tested individual stones for movement, and examined the drainage system I had built into the structure. Throughout the inspection, they maintained a running commentary about the techniques they observed, using terminology that clearly demonstrated their expertise. Judith watched the proceedings with growing unease, though she tried to maintain her air of authority. When Andrea began taking photographs and making notes, Judith interrupted. "Excuse me, but what exactly are you documenting? This is still a violation regardless of how well it might be built." Andrea looked up from her notebook with a patient expression. "Ma'am, I'm documenting what appears to be master-level stonework. The techniques used here are quite sophisticated." "Sophisticated how?" Judith challenged. "It's just stacked rocks without any mortar." "How is that sophisticated?" This was the moment I had been waiting for. Andrea straightened up and faced Judith directly, her voice taking on the tone of someone who had spent decades teaching complex concepts to skeptical students. "Ma'am, what you're looking at is dry stone construction, one of the most demanding forms of masonry in existence. Every stone in this wall has been individually fitted and positioned to create a structure that's actually stronger than mortared construction. The builder has used traditional techniques, including proper batter, through stones for structural integrity, and a drainage system that will prevent frost damage. Judith's confidence was starting to waver, but she pressed on. That may be, but it still doesn't meet our community standards. We require modern construction methods that are consistent with the neighborhood aesthetic. Andrea exchanged glances with her colleagues before responding. I'm curious about your background in construction and design. What qualifications do you have to assess the appropriateness of traditional building techniques? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Judith's face flushed as she realized she was being asked to justify her expertise in front of actual professionals. I don't need construction experience to interpret HOA guidelines, she said defensively. I'm elected to represent the community's interests and maintain our standards. Of course, Andrea replied smoothly, but when those standards involve technical assessments of construction quality and structural integrity, wouldn't it be appropriate to consult with qualified professionals? She gestured toward my wall. For example, you mentioned that this construction method is inferior to modern techniques. Can you explain specifically why dry stone construction would be less suitable than mortared masonry for a retaining wall of this type? Judith was clearly out of her depth, but she couldn't back down without losing face in front of the other board members. Well, obviously, without mortar, the stones could shift or fall out of place. It's a safety issue. Andrea nodded thoughtfully. That's an interesting theory. Have you seen evidence of stone movement or instability in this particular wall? Not yet, Judith admitted, but that doesn't mean it won't happen. These amateur construction methods aren't reliable long-term. The word amateur seemed to hit Andrea like a physical blow. Her expression hardened as she realized the full scope of what Judith was claiming. Ma'am, Andrea said with icy professionalism, I need to correct a serious misunderstanding. This wall was not built by an amateur. The craftsmanship I'm seeing here represents years of training and experience. The stone selection, fitting, and placement are all executed at a level that most professional masons would struggle to achieve. She pointed to specific features as she continued. Look at these joints. Each stone has been shaped to fit perfectly with its neighbors, creating continuous bearing surfaces that distribute weight evenly throughout the structure. The courses are level within a tolerance of less than a quarter inch over 30 feet. The batter is precisely calculated to provide maximum stability while maintaining an attractive appearance. Judith tried to interrupt, but Andrea wasn't finished. Furthermore, the builder has incorporated traditional elements that demonstrate advanced understanding of stone construction principles. These through stones, for example, extend completely through the wall to tie the front and back faces together. This drainage system will prevent water buildup that could cause frost damage. Even the capstones are fitted with a slight crown to shed water away from the joints. By now, a small crowd had gathered to watch the proceedings. Several neighbors had come out to see what was happening, drawn by the unusual sight of professionals examining my wall with such obvious intensity. I could see Judith becoming increasingly uncomfortable as she realized that her authority was being challenged in front of the entire community. Andrea turned to address the growing audience. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to understand what you're looking at here. This wall represents traditional craftsmanship at its finest. The techniques used in its construction have been proven over centuries of use, and the execution is absolutely flawless. Whoever built this wall is operating at a level that most professional masons aspire to, but rarely achieve. The crowd murmured appreciatively, and I could see several neighbors taking photos with their phones. Nathan Moore stepped forward with a broad smile. That's Raymond's work. He's been building that wall for the past month, working on it every morning before his regular job. Andrea's eyebrows shot up in surprise. You built this yourself? When I nodded, she shook her head in amazement. Where did you learn these techniques? This is master-level work. I explained my background briefly, mentioning my years of study in Europe and my ongoing involvement with traditional building preservation projects. Remarkable, Andrea said. I've seen professional masons with decades of experience produce work that wasn't this precise. She turned back to Judith, who was looking increasingly pale. Ms. Gutierrez, I need to ask you a direct question. Based on what authority did you determine that this wall represents amateur workmanship? Judith's voice was barely above a whisper. I was just interpreting the HOA guidelines based on community standards. Andrea's expression softened slightly, but her words remained firm. Ma'am, with all due respect, architectural guidelines are one thing, but technical assessments of construction quality require actual expertise. What you've described as amateur work is actually some of the finest stonework I've seen in my 30-year career. The silence that followed was deafening. Judith stood frozen, clutching her clipboard like a shield, as the full weight of her mistake became clear to everyone present. She had publicly dismissed master-level craftsmanship as amateur work, demonstrating her complete lack of qualification to make such judgments. Jeremy Peterson chose that moment to arrive, and I quickly brought him up to speed on the assessment. As a lawyer, he immediately grasped the significance of what had just transpired. Ms. Gutierrez, he said politely, I'm Jeremy Peterson, Mr. Cook's legal counsel. I've been reviewing the HOA covenants, and I'm particularly interested in the clause regarding traditional construction techniques of exceptional quality. Judith's face went even paler. The presence of a lawyer suggested that this situation was about to become much more serious than a simple HOA dispute. The board has already determined that this wall doesn't meet community standards, she said weakly. Based on what criteria? Jeremy asked. According to the professional assessment we just heard, this wall represents exceptional quality traditional construction. It seems to fit exactly within the guidelines for case-by-case approval. He paused to let that sink in. I'm curious about the board's process for evaluating technical construction matters. Do you typically consult with qualified professionals before making determinations about structural integrity and construction quality? The question was clearly rhetorical, and everyone present understood the implication. Judith had made authoritative statements about technical matters that were completely outside her area of expertise, potentially exposing the HOA to liability if her decisions were challenged in court. Andrea stepped forward again, addressing the crowd that had continued to grow. I want to make sure everyone understands the significance of what we've examined here today. This wall is not just acceptable construction, it's exemplary construction. The Regional Mason Guild would be proud to feature this work in our publications as an example of traditional techniques properly applied in a modern context. She pulled out her phone and began taking additional photographs. In fact, I'd like to request permission to document this wall for our training materials. It's rare to see dry stone construction executed at this level, especially in a residential setting. The crowd buzzed with excitement, and I could see several neighbors looking at my wall with new appreciation. Judith made one last, desperate attempt to maintain her authority. Regardless of the construction quality, this wall still violates our architectural guidelines. The board has the authority to enforce community standards, and we've determined that this type of construction isn't appropriate for our neighborhood. Andrea's response was swift and decisive. Ma'am, I respectfully disagree with your assessment, and this wall enhances the neighborhood's appearance significantly. The natural stone provides visual interest and texture that concrete simply cannot match. More importantly, it demonstrates a level of craftsmanship that actually increases property values throughout the community. She gestured toward the surrounding houses. Traditional stonework like this is considered a premium feature in residential construction. Having examples of master-level craftsmanship in the neighborhood creates a positive impression that benefits all residents. Several neighbors nodded in agreement, and I could see the tide of public opinion shifting decisively against Judith's position. Jeremy Peterson seized the moment to make his legal position clear. Ms. Gutierrez, based on the professional assessment we've heard today, it appears that this wall clearly qualifies for approval under the traditional construction clause in your architectural guidelines. The Guild's evaluation demonstrates exceptional quality, and the visual impact is obviously positive. He paused to consult his notes. I'm concerned about the HOA's process for handling this matter. Mr. Cook was threatened with fines and legal action based on what appears to be a fundamental misunderstanding of both the construction quality and the applicable guidelines. This suggests that the board may not have adequate procedures in place for evaluating technical matters. The legal implications were becoming clear to everyone, including Judith. She had not only made incorrect assessments about my wall's quality and appropriateness, but she had done so in a way that could expose the HOA to significant liability. If I chose to pursue legal action, her public statements about structural integrity and safety could be used as evidence of negligent decision-making. Andrea began packing up her tools, but before leaving, she made one final statement that would seal Judith's fate. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to officially announce that the Regional Mason Guild recognizes this wall as a masterwork of traditional stone construction. We will be recommending it for inclusion in our annual showcase of exemplary craftsmanship. She handed me an official guild certificate, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. Mr. Cook, on behalf of the Regional Mason Guild, I present you with our certificate of Master Craftsmanship in recognition of your exceptional stonework. This certificate acknowledges that your construction meets the highest standards of traditional masonry and represents a significant contribution to the preservation of traditional building arts. The crowd erupted in applause, and I felt a surge of vindication that was almost overwhelming. After weeks of being treated like an incompetent amateur by Judith, I was being publicly recognized by the region's premier masonry organization for the quality of my work. Judith stood motionless, her clipboard hanging limply at her side, as she watched her entire narrative collapse around her. The wall she had dismissed as amateur work was now officially recognized as a masterpiece. The man she had treated as a rule-breaking troublemaker had been revealed as a master craftsman whose work would be featured in professional publications. Nathan Morris stepped forward to congratulate me, followed by several other neighbors who had been quietly supportive throughout the ordeal. Raymond, he said with a grin, I think it's safe to say that your wall has been approved by the Architectural Review Committee. The crowd laughed, and even some of the HOA board members who had arrived with Judith were smiling. Jeremy Peterson approached Judith with a document folder. Ms. Gutierrez, I have a formal request for the board's consideration. Based on today's professional assessment, we're requesting immediate approval of Mr. Cook's wall under the traditional construction clause of your architectural guidelines. We're also requesting that all fines and violations be withdrawn and that the HOA issue a formal apology for the mishandling of this matter. Judith's voice was barely audible when she finally responded. I'll need to discuss this with the rest of the board. Jeremy nodded politely. Of course. However, I should mention that if this matter isn't resolved satisfactorily, we're prepared to pursue legal action for harassment, defamation, and negligent enforcement of HOA covenants. The professional assessment we've received today provides strong evidence that the HOA's actions were not based on legitimate community interests. The legal threat was clear, and Judith understood that she was in an impossible position. She could continue fighting a battle that she had already lost publicly, potentially exposing the HOA to expensive litigation, or she could accept defeat and try to minimize the damage to her reputation. Andrea approached me one final time before leaving. Raymond, I want you to know that the Guild would be honored to have you as a member. Your work demonstrates exactly the kind of traditional craftsmanship we're trying to preserve and promote. She handed me her business card. Please consider joining us for our next regional meeting. I think you'd find our community of traditional builders very welcoming. As the crowd began to disperse, several neighbors stopped to examine my wall more closely, now understanding what they were looking at. Jessica Myers, who lived across the street, shook her head in amazement. I had no idea this was such skilled work. I just thought it looked nice. Her husband nodded in agreement. It's incredible to think that someone in our neighborhood can build something like this. The transformation in community perception was remarkable. In the space of a single morning, my wall had gone from being viewed as a rule violation to being recognized as a neighborhood asset. More importantly, Judith's authority and credibility had been completely undermined in front of the entire community. Over the next few days, the story of the Stonewall assessment spread throughout the subdivision. Neighbors who had never spoken to me before stopped by to compliment my work and ask questions about traditional building techniques. Several people mentioned that they had always thought Judith was too rigid in her interpretation of the HOA guidelines, and that this incident had confirmed their suspicions. The HOA board met in emergency session 3 days after the Guild assessment. According to Nathan Morris, who attended the meeting, the discussion was brief and decisive. Faced with overwhelming evidence of Judith's mistake and the threat of legal action, the board voted unanimously to approve my wall and withdraw all violations and fines. More significantly, they also voted to establish new procedures for handling technical construction matters, requiring consultation with qualified professionals before making determinations about structural integrity or construction quality. It was a clear rebuke of Judith's approach and an acknowledgement that the board needed better expertise to make informed decisions. Judith submitted her resignation as HOA president the following week. In her resignation letter, which was circulated to all residents, she cited philosophical differences with the board regarding community standards, but made no mention of the stone wall incident. However, everyone in the neighborhood understood the real reason for her departure. The aftermath of Judith's resignation brought about significant changes in how the HOA operated. Janet Williams, a retired architect who had been serving as a regular board member, was elected as the new president. Her first initiative was to revise the architectural guidelines to include clearer criteria for evaluating construction quality and to establish a process for consulting with relevant professionals when technical expertise was needed. Under Janet's leadership, the board also implemented a more collaborative approach to architectural review, focusing on helping residents achieve their goals while maintaining reasonable community standards. The adversarial relationship that had characterized Judith's tenure was replaced by a partnership model that recognized residents' expertise and encouraged quality improvements. My wall became something of a neighborhood landmark, with visitors often stopping to admire the craftsmanship. The Regional Mason Guild featured it in their quarterly newsletter, and Andrea Ortiz brought several groups of apprentice masons to study the construction techniques I had used. The wall that Judith had tried to force me to tear down became a source of community pride and a teaching tool for traditional building arts. 6 months later, I received a call from a local television station that was doing a feature story about traditional craftsmanship in modern communities. They had heard about my wall through the Mason Guild and wanted to film a segment about the preservation of traditional building techniques. The irony wasn't lost on me that the wall Judith had dismissed as inappropriate was now being celebrated as an example of cultural preservation. During the filming, the reporter asked me about the HOA dispute and how it had been resolved. I chose my words carefully, focusing on the positive outcome rather than dwelling on the conflict. The situation taught everyone involved about the importance of seeking expert opinions when dealing with technical matters, I said. It also demonstrated that traditional craftsmanship can coexist beautifully with modern community standards when there's mutual understanding and respect. The story aired during the station's evening news program, bringing even more attention to our neighborhood and my wall. Several viewers contacted me about commissioning similar work for their own properties, and I found myself with more stonework projects than I could handle in my spare time. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that Judith's aggressive opposition to my wall had actually created an opportunity to educate the community about traditional building arts and to establish better procedures for architectural review. Her attempt to exercise arbitrary authority had backfired spectacularly, resulting in exactly the opposite of what she had intended. The lesson wasn't lost on other HOA boards in the area. Jeremy Peterson told me that he had received several calls from board members wanting to review their own procedures for handling technical construction matters. The story of Judith's public humiliation had spread throughout the local HOA community, serving as a cautionary tale about the importance of consulting qualified experts before making authoritative pronouncements about construction quality. Today, 3 years after the incident, my stone wall continues to be a source of pride for our neighborhood. The natural stone has weathered beautifully, developing a subtle patina that only enhances its appearance. The drainage system I built into the structure has prevented any frost damage, and the wall remains perfectly stable and level despite several harsh winters. More importantly, the incident fundamentally changed how our community approaches architectural review and resident relations. The new procedures established after Judith's resignation have prevented similar conflicts and have actually encouraged several residents to undertake high-quality improvement projects that have enhanced the neighborhood's overall appearance. Andrea Ortiz and I have remained in contact, and I've become an active member of the Regional Mason Guild. I've taught several workshops on traditional stone construction techniques, and I've helped with restoration projects at historic sites throughout the region. What started as a simple home improvement project has evolved into a meaningful connection to a community of craftspeople dedicated to preserving traditional building arts. The experience taught me valuable lessons about standing up for quality work and the importance of having expert support when facing bureaucratic opposition. It also demonstrated that even the most entrenched authority figures can be held accountable when their decisions are based on ignorance rather than legitimate expertise. For anyone facing similar situations with overzealous HOA enforcement, my advice is to document everything carefully, seek expert opinions when technical matters are involved, and don't be intimidated by bureaucratic posturing. Quality work speaks for itself, and qualified professionals will recognize and defend excellent craftsmanship regardless of political considerations. The stone wall that Judith Gutierrez tried so hard to eliminate now stands as a testament to the power of expertise over arbitrary authority. Every morning when I look out at those perfectly fitted stones, I'm reminded that true quality endures long after petty conflicts are forgotten. The wall will likely outlast all of us, continuing to demonstrate the beauty and durability of traditional craftsmanship for generations to come. Sometimes the best response to unreasonable authority is simply to do excellent work and let the experts speak for themselves. In my case, that approach not only saved my wall, but also helped create a better, more collaborative community for everyone involved. Judith may have thought she was protecting neighborhood standards, but in the end, she learned that real standards are set by knowledge, skill, and respect for quality craftsmanship, not by arbitrary rules enforced through bureaucratic intimidation.